Welcome back to another episode of A World in Tension. My name is Neil Placer, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rob McGarvey. Well, we've been on a wild journey, and part of what we're doing on this show is trying to get people to stop and reflect and consider the tensions in their life, not just push them away, but to deeply reflect. And one of those things we really got to reflect on at its kind of deepest core is, what's our identity? Who are we really? What are we living for? And I think we're traveling pretty far for this virtual road trip.
Yeah, I'm not sure we can call it a road trip. It may be like a flight involved. It's an air trip.
So where are we going, Rob?
Well, we're headed to the Middle East, which is a first for us. And we're going to be speaking with Chris Hantla, who is a coach with an organization called Identity Exchange. He lives in the Middle East with his wife and three children. He has a master's degree in international studies, cultural studies, and he works with people to try to help them, bring out their best identity and identify where and who their identity is in.
Chris, tell us a little about yourself and kind of the connection to the Winships and how we got connected.
Guys, thanks so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. And so a little about my journey. I grew up in Oklahoma, and I took my first job out of college in Baghdad, Iraq, and I worked for an NGO there. And while I was working there, I met this couple that really they looked at life so differently. They operated in a way that I had never seen people operate in. I was just intrigued. And my wife and I met. We were actually on the same team, working for the same organization, doing humanitarian work. And they mentored both of us, and for the last 20 years, they've just been like spiritual mom and dad to us. And about 5 years ago, they started a company called Identity Exchange, and loved coaching in all capacities. I'm an identity coach with Identity Exchange, but I also love sports. And so a few years ago, I was coaching American football here in the Middle East, and actually just during one of our games, we were doing a scrimmage, and I ruptured my Achilles. And I grew up playing soccer. That was my main sport, and I loved scoring goals. So the idea of kind of stepping back from being off the field, whatever that meant, and kind of onto the sidelines felt in some ways like death. But the next morning, I'm laying there on my back, hadn't even seen a doctor yet, can't move, just in a lot of pain. And I just kind of prayed this prayer that I always pray, that I was taught by Jamie and Donna. God, what do you want me to know about this? And I just kind of sensed this chuckle in his voice, like, I told you were going to stop playing football or playing whatever, and you were going to start coaching. And so this is going to be a season for you to learn how to coach. And so I kind of surrendered to that idea. Didn't know what that meant, but I did. I just kind of put my heart out there for him, and I said, if that's what we're moving into, then you're going to have to show me how to do it. And about 6 months later, I was with Jamie and Donna, and they were talking about how they'd just started this new company called Identity Exchange. And I was telling them about what had happened. And I said, God's asking me to be a coach, and I don't know what that means. And Donna looked at me and she goes, it's an identity coach. You're going to be one of our identity coaches. I was like, I'm in, I didn't even check with my wife. I just said yes. And so that's how I started into this role with them.
Welcome to A World in Tension podcast, a place where we examine the opposing pulls and struggles of life to uncover clarity, purpose, and practical solutions. Come join us as we seek to get comfortable facing the uncomfortable. This is A World in Tension.
I want to kind of talk about the Winships a little bit, because they have a book called Living Fearless, and they're the ones who started the Identity Exchange. But I think what's really cool is not so much that they've written a book, but that they have been in your life. Both him and his wife have been in your life and your wife's life to mentor you, and that they're living out the principles that they're teaching you, but you're also catching it, and how the importance of that. So talk about the role of of mentoring and how important that has been for you to even just discover your own identity.
How we understand identity is by what we do, what we have, and what people think about us. Like, that's primarily in the Western world how we operate. That is where we get our identity from. What subtly that did for me, it was I began looking for like, so where's going to be my place? Where's my place in the world that I'm going to kind of win at or dominate? And I think even education teaches this. Like, again, it's not an explicit message. It's very implicit. What's below that? It's identity for me is belonging. It is where we look to get our sense of value and worth from. Where are we looking to find security? And ultimately, like, purpose. What's the purpose of life, and where do I find that? So, and I think in the West we invert that and we make it so that our sense of value is coming from what we do, as opposed to flowing from who we are. And we're trying to get worth from the things we do. And ultimately, we have more worth if we're beating somebody or winning in our particular area of expertise. I always kind of had this subtle lie or this message that just kind of worked its way into me. And it was, you're just not enough for that. You're not enough for this. You're not enough in that. You're not good enough. And so it was always like, man, and I would try out stuff and I wouldn't be the best. And it's like, okay, this obviously isn't my area. So I would quit, even if I loved doing it. Like, there was a season, again, I loved playing soccer growing up, but there was a season where I just quit because I'm like, I'm not good enough at this. And I'd lost the joy in it. It had become all about competition and winning. And just the joy of the game was gone from me all of a sudden. And I can remember being 17 years old and reading the book of Ecclesiastes. And man, we look to find our identity in everything, and it's just vanity. Like, what the world has to offer, it's just, it leaves us really empty at the end of the day, and it's just vanity. And so my takeaway after reading that, it kind of deconstructed some of the American worldview that I was carrying around, that American script that I had gotten into myself at the time. And so I kind of turned like to religion at that point. So, and I was good at it. I knew the Bible. Again, I'd grown up in the church, and I knew how to do church well. And I don't mean that in like the real positive sense either. I kind of almost in the Pharisaical sense of like the ego, the persona that you put forward, that we can inadvertently take on when we walk into a church. And, we'd be fighting in the car on the way to church, but then we'd put on our smiles and walk in and pretend like everything was okay. And so that became my new identity. I mean, that became the area, the space for me that I felt like I could really win at.
So a lot of what you're saying, I think, is going on where people are finding kind of their security, their identity there, but they're not really looking at God's purposes. Like, that was one of the categories. So, like, just kind of reflect for a minute as you're kind of telling your story of what do you wish was happening? Like, what could happen in a church environment to work against that? I mean, is it authenticity? Is it what? I mean, what are your thoughts? What kind of church do you wish as a kid someone kind of shook you out of that?
I had a great group of friends, and we were really authentic with one another. We would go deep. We would share vulnerably, and it would happen, oddly enough, a lot of times outside the walls of church. It would be like after church when we would go eat together, or we'd be driving on the way to somewhere and just doing life on life, real in one another's lives and sharing those deep stories. And that was really, I can literally remember my friend saying to me after, an hour-long conversation of actually really deeply sharing our hearts and our fears and our vulnerabilities. He said, this felt more like church than anything I've actually done at church before.
Wow.
And I had to agree. I was like, yeah, I think that's exactly right. Our small groups tend to be more of a place of authenticity than what we get in more of the corporate settings. And so that's always made me kind of sad. And it's always made me wonder, actually, also, like, is this model that we currently have, or at least the one I grew up with, is this really what God intended for his body? And I think the takeaway from that, and in my journey, what I've moved more toward is, small groups. And like I would consider what we do now, we work in team, but we do life together. And what I learned from the Winships, what I learned from the years with them, was exactly that. We were doing life on life together and really diving into one another's stories and journeys, and then just spurring one another on.
Let's continue into your story. So now you go to the Middle East, and I think you have this very Western mentality. So pick up the story there and tell us what's going on.
Yeah, so after college, I moved to Baghdad, took a job with, like I said, an NGO to work. But the story I was carrying within was not just where am I looking to get my worth and value, but the story itself was we're right, they're wrong. So there was this whole team component to the worldview I was carrying. So a big part of my story was, as a Christian and as an American, I grew up hearing that Muslims in the Middle East were our enemies. And so I went, not with the military to kind of fight and conquer, but really with the Bible. I was going to conquer them with my religion. And I was going to get into arguments, and I had learned great ways to do apologetics, and we were going to argue it out, and I was going to win the day. And hopefully, bring them onto my team. That was kind of my mentality. If they can come onto my team, then they'll no longer want to kill us or whatever, but that's, as a 20-year-old, that's how I was thinking about the world. And so I move overseas to Baghdad, and one of the things that really struck me immediately, like the first conversation, I kind of thought that I'd be greeted as like this liberating, oh, you're an American, you liberated us, thank you so much. And the first conversation I had was, you destroyed our country. Like, your country, not you, but your country doing what it wanted to do destroyed our country. And I thought, oh, what do I do with that? And almost immediately, I kind of just didn't have a response to that. It was, but well, let me, here's the gospel. Here's what I do have to give you. You're going to die one day and stand before your maker. But as I drove around the city those first couple of weeks and just saw the destruction, I was like, I'm not sure my gospel's big enough for this. I'm not sure I even know what the gospel is and what good can I do here. And it was really just immediately start a little bit disillusioning for me. And it was pretty quick after that I met Jamie and Donna, and like I said, their lives and the way that they were thinking about things and doing things was just so different from me, and it was so loving, and they seemed to really care about the people they were working with.
One of Jamie and Donna's main messages in their book called Living Fearless is that they believe that fear is a driving emotion, like I think the primary driving emotion for us not finding our identity. And, I have to, stop again as I think about the Western church and getting caught in the media cycles. And I think I've seen, in the last 5 years, just Christians more and more driven by fear and like what's going to happen and all these forces working against them, and let's bunker down. I've seen so much of that. So can you talk a little bit? I mean, do I have that right about fear? And that's kind of the strong connection to identity?
I think what God does in the discipleship process of all of this, and I watch Jesus do this with his own disciples, is he strips away everything that's false within us, anything that we make into an idol to try to find our worth or value in, or our security in, or we're looking to it for a sense of purpose that's outside of him. He will strip that away. And if we know that this is what he's doing, we can align with him, and it doesn't feel painful. In fact, we welcome it. But what we do is really resist that process. So we lose a job, and immediately we think, and we go into suffering or something, and it feels like, God, why did you let this happen to me? We ask these big questions like that. But what I think God is doing in all of that is trying to expose or shine a light on the fact that we've turned our job into a place of security. We're looking to that thing more than we are to him. We were scheduled as a whole team to go to Jordan for some R&R. The morning we were leaving Baghdad, there was this explosion at about 4 a.m. It woke me up, rattled our house. It was just outside of our neighborhood. And then for the next 3 hours, there was this really tremendous gun battle, and I could hear it going on. And at first it was like, okay, I'm okay. Nothing's happened. I'm fine. But the longer and longer it went on, I just remember covering my head with a pillow and just begging God to make it stop. And the only thought that kept going through my head is, people are killing each other right now. And I'm just laying in my bed listening to it happen. And it really disturbed me. And of course, it really produced a lot of fear in me. A week into being in Jordan, and we're thinking about then going back to Baghdad. And I'm getting more and more anxious. And we go out just for a walk as a team. And I'm telling Donna Winship this tension that I'm having, the fear that I'm having. And I at a real surface level, it was, probably making excuses, because that's what we do. We cover up our fears and our anxieties, and we spiritualize them and slap Band-Aids on them and all that stuff. But she saw through it all, and she just said, Chris, would you be willing to just sit with me for, an hour and a half, and I'll ask some questions to God, and I'm going to let him talk to you about this stuff. And I looked at her again. One of my assumptions growing up was, God gave us the Bible, and he speaks in the Bible, and that's that. But I trusted Donna enough. Like, again, I had seen their lives at that point, and I really respected them, and they were carrying something that I didn't have. And so I was like, yeah, let's do it. I don't know what you're talking about, but let's do it. And so here's what happened. Donna and I sit down together, and she asks God, what is the main feeling that Chris is feeling? And I was like, I'm not a guy. I don't typically think about my feelings. And so I said, yeah, I'm kind of afraid. That's what I'm sensing, is just like, yeah, I'm feeling some fear in this. And she asked God, what are the lies that Chris is believing, driving this fear? And I was quiet for a minute, and again, it was like, this is what we call listening prayer, but it's really contemplation. And I go back to like the Psalms, and there's this strange word, Selah, in the Psalms. I think in the Hebrew, most people are like, yeah, we're not actually sure exactly what this word means, but it gets translated pause or, stop. But I really think where you find that word is after something significant is said. Like, I want you, it's almost a word that means like, okay, now stop and listen and let God speak to your heart now. Like, and the only way we as humans can think differently about something is if we receive something from outside of us and it comes into us. And so that is what contemplation or listening prayer is. It's having a higher thought than the one that we normally are having, especially can have if we're in a place of fear. And so that's what Donna was taking me through that day.
When you're sitting with her this first time that she asked you to do this, was it hard for you to decipher what was, in a sense, God speaking to you versus what you were thinking, like your thoughts? Like, how did you ascribe, a thought to God and not to yourself?
I was very skeptical that I was even hearing God that very first time. And that's always the question, right? How do I know this isn't just me or not? And the big thing was, I kept saying or thinking out loud, like, wow, that's not a normal thought that I normally have. That one, I don't think that way. Like, it was so contrary to my normal thought processes. And it was a really kind voice. I was really hard on myself. Someone who needs to be perfect and live up to all these expectations religiously and everything else. This voice was just so different. And it produced almost immediately a peace and a rest. The fruit of the Spirit produces a condition in our heart out of which we can live. And so love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. And so what I began to learn that day was, when God speaks to us, it produces peace and a rest and a confidence and and really a joy. That was my response after that. Then for the next 10 days, I came into that time really afraid, like shaking, and it was that was producing in me like a real tension. I do not want to go back. And it was the outward fruit that was producing. I left that feeling like I was floating on air and just full of joy. And God, you're with me. I cannot believe that you're so good, that you would talk to me, that you would speak to my heart in this way. And that was really the way I knew that God was speaking. What I did after that was I got a journal. I was kind of a journaler anyway, but I got 2 colored pens, one red, one black. And I started journaling different. I would ask a question to God in black, and then I would just kind of wait, and whatever came to my mind, I would write it in red, just assuming like this is a growth process. I don't have to get this perfect. And over time, I'll learn to discern the difference between my voice, the voice of condemnation, the voice, and it's funny because we actually know the voice of condemnation. We know that one like really well. And we don't doubt Satan's ability to speak to us because we all know that voice, but we do doubt the kindness of God's voice and when he speaks to us. So we have that within us. But this journaling process that I started over the next 6 months was basically an experiment to see if I can ask God questions and just kind of then start journaling or writing, can I actually go back and discern like, yeah, that seems like God speaking to me. That seems like his leading. And then we got to get into the what does God actually want to talk to us about? That's another really important question.
I really like that experiment that you did and figuring that out. I've never heard that before. And I think it's very interesting. It's interesting that you point out that we know the condemnation voice, but it's sometimes hard to know what's the good voice. Besides, I've had similar thoughts. Like it's something like when I feel this prompting to encourage someone, I'm like, that's not my natural thought. So I should probably act on it and encourage that person, But let me ask you a practical question that I think people are probably thinking about. I'm assuming you're taking this and you're bringing it back and aligning it with spiritual principles and guidance from the Bible, right? Because otherwise you could just be distracted by your own, like, hey, I have this new prophetic word that doesn't exist anywhere. And so, I mean, do you come back and align that up with Scripture, or how does that work?
I would say the 3 tests, if you will, for discerning, and that's really what this is. It's a discernment of God's voice versus just whatever other thing we're thinking about. But it's always going to be the body of Christ. So we do it in community. We listen in community. And that became a huge part of our story. What we began doing as a team, and I began learning from Jamie and Donna, we would do these listening times together then. And we would share what we were sensing. And you can, you hear somebody say something in your spirit, you're like, yeah, there's some truth in that, but there's something that's probably a little bit off about that. And then of course, scriptures. Yeah. Like the Holy Spirit inspired scripture. And that's the natural language and lens and how he speaks. And so that's what it's going to feel like. That's what it's going to sound like. And the fruit that it produces is the third thing. It's going to produce the kind of fruit that God said the kingdom will produce. It's not going to produce something that is contrary to scripture or like what the kingdom looks like. What is the if it produces selfishness and selfish ambition and a big head and an ego and all of that stuff, well, that's probably not God. I can say definitively that there's something off about what you're experiencing in those moments of listening.
I really like what you're saying about listening in prayer. I mean, we talked to Paul Miller about praying corporately, and I think listening and how like we don't take the time to just, I think we feel uncomfortable just sitting there for a second and saying, God, what are you trying to tell me? And pausing and waiting and opening up the word and reading and waiting. I don't think we're good at doing that. So, I mean, if you were right now leading a seminar to a church that said, we really have, like, how do we incorporate some of this identity finding into a corporate body? Like what would you tell them? Because like we've gotten off track, we've become too, whatever, pharisaical, or on the other side, we've become too driven by our own emotions. Like how would you help ground people again as a collective? Is it both that they would need to do individual kind of reflection, but kind of how do they do it together?
When I first learned, it was just kind of a one-on-one process, and it was almost like a three-way conversation, right? It was the conversation between God. If I'm receiving, then it was between me and then the person who was facilitating that, and just kind of asking the questions. And again, wherever two or more are gathered there. But then we've done this as a team in groups and small groups, and we will just kind of lead through various exercises. And what it really comes down to is, when I think about listening to God, what does he actually want to speak to us about? Because sometimes we bring questions to him, and then we want him to answer those questions for us. And then we feel like we don't hear anything, or we don't sense anything from him, and we walk away discouraged from that. And really, it's because I think we're kind of missing what he wants to talk to us about. And it's really our own heart, our identity. Like, that is the core thing he wants to talk to us about. I go back to like Romans 12, be transformed in the renewing of your mind. And God's will, this is 1 Thessalonians, God's will is that you're sanctified. What I would come to God with often was like, should I take this job or that job? And it was, I'd sit there and wait, and I just wouldn't get a sense of anything. Or I would ask like, well, how do I do something? Or can you give me an idea for something? And it wouldn't seem to come. But then when I would allow God's light to shine in my heart and really go deep into my own self and really, God, would you show me what I'm really afraid of? And boom, it's like, that doesn't take long to hear something like that in prayer. It's like the Holy Spirit brings that up to our mind. Okay, so if that's what I'm afraid of, God, what am I believing about that? What am I believing about you in that? And boom, it comes pretty quick to your mind. Okay, and so if that's what I'm believing, what's the truth? Then there's this exchange. That's the repentance, the metanosis, the change of your thinking that leads to a change in your behavior. And so there's a good friend of mine here. He's a Muslim background guy. When we met, he was one of our football players, and he shared with me a story, just really touched me. I was just moved by his story. Kind of kicked out of his house when he was young, not because he did anything wrong, but at 14, his parents just didn't want to take care of him anymore. They didn't have the finances or whatever it was. They just didn't want to take care of him. So he grew up out on the streets and then kind of raised himself, did the best he could. And I was really impressed with who he was. And he comes to me one day, and his dad had died and left inheritance to he and his siblings. And his brothers, who were married and had kids, had already blown through the inheritance money. And he was embroiled in this whole court lawsuit thing, and his brothers were suing him for basically just take his money from him. And so that's the external conflict. And so I just asked him, I said, if you could be quiet for a second, like, describe to me the external conflict. And he describes it. He's telling me, in court, my lawyer's not very good, their lawyers are good, and I'm probably going to lose this case, and blah, 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 the whole thing. And I said, okay, how is it making you feeling? How is that making you feel? Dive internal for a minute. And he said, well, I'm mad at my brothers. And I said, yeah, I can understand that. I totally get that. Go a little deeper. And I just asked him, what are you afraid of in all of this? And he said, well, I'm afraid that I'll lose this money. And I said, well, what'll happen if you lose this money? Dive in deeper. Like, okay, so you lose the money. What'll happen then if you lose them? Well, if I lose this money, then I'm not going to be able to pay rent. Okay, keep going. And what if? What's the other what if in this? Yeah, and if I can't pay rent, then maybe I'll be out on the streets. And if I'm out on the streets, then I may end up dying. And I said, okay, so what are you believing about God? And he stopped and he was quiet for a second. And he said, I'm believing that God doesn't see me. He doesn't care about me. And as we pushed in, he began to see like, oh, yeah, here's what's driving this whole thing. And he told me, he said, I am trusting in this money more than I am in God. okay, God, what do you want him to know about this situation? What do you want him to know about you? What do you want him to know about himself? And he was quiet and he kept listening. And he said, man, it's crazy, but I feel like God is showing me that no matter what happens tomorrow, he's got me. And I said, how do you think your brothers are feeling? What's their internal conflict? And he said, it's the exact same thing. Like immediately he goes, they're feeling afraid too. That's why they're doing this. They're afraid for their families. They see me as a single guy and I don't have kids and they deserve it. And how are they going to pay for their kids? So that's what's motivated. They're afraid. That's what's happening here. And I asked him, I said, do you think you could forgive this is before he ever went into court. Do you think you could forgive your brothers for what they're doing to you right now? And he grinned and he said, I can actually forgive them for their fear. Yeah, I can, because they're just believing the same lies I am. And that's where this conflict is coming from.
I would encourage you to listen to our first season, episode 3, where we talk about 3 layers of tension: the external tension, the natural internal tension, which is lower than that, which is kind of between your heart and mind, and then the spiritual internal tension on the very inside, which is the battle with God, or the discussion with God. And it's just so cool, like the connection between what you just said. And I think what you're doing that's neat is it's an internal reflection with someone guiding you through. That's pretty awesome and pretty it's just a deep experience. But what we talk about too is then coming back out of the layers of tension once God changes you to be an agent of redemption in this world. Again, bringing it back to the local church and people we interact with. How do you show that change and encourage people in that change? Would it be to kind of have some of these conversations at a deeper level where you're inviting God in, or what would you say?
We do this process together. The first question we will ask one another is, what are you feeling really burdened about today? What's feeling really heavy in life? And just sit with that for a second and write it down. And we don't share anything at first. It's just quiet, might have some worship music on. And then Jesus says, bring all your burdens to me. And so, Jesus, what's underneath this burden? What am I afraid of? Is there anything I'm afraid of attached to this burden that I'm carrying around right now? And then it's what's the truth? What do you want me to know? What lie am I believing? What's attached to this burden? I have to train my heart and mind to be ever aware of his presence, which is really, if you want a good definition of listening prayer, it's like Brother Lawrence saying it's practicing the presence of God. How much does that change if in any situation I come into, I'm aware that I'm not alone and it's not all up to me? That just changes something. It changes our perspective. We have a higher perspective on things, a more creative way to even interact with that.
I wish you and I could sit down and have a cup of coffee, because Brother Lawrence has been one of the most impactful books to me. So it's just crazy the things you're saying about that.
So as you would think about what you would want the listener to hear, how does the church, or how should the church practically begin to process listening to God better? What are some practical ways that you could see that happening within the church?
We went to this mega church, actually. It was a really large church in Houston, and got connected in with people. And we started just real small, like with small groups with people. And we began inviting them into this process of just listening to God. We would do it. Again, just have a few questions that we can ask God, and then we'll listen, then we'll share those with one another. So it started out in small groups, but it kind of just sort of slowly took off. And what ended up happening was we had a great Wednesday night prayer and worship time. It was really, out of everything that the church was doing, it was one of the most amazing services, like even better than the Sunday morning services and stuff. And it was a beautiful time. I love bringing in this element of contemplative listening and receiving, and then being able to pray or even intercede out of what you're hearing, versus just kind of like throwing up prayers and hoping that some of them stick or whatever, And I don't mean that sounds crude, and I'm not knocking that, but I so value this way of prayer. And so, but in the church, it got to the place where then there was an opportunity to invite the entire congregation at that Wednesday night service into prayer, into listening. And we just took, again, the instruments were playing, and they let me go up and take 5 minutes and just kind of lead through. I think I just asked 3 or 4 questions, and then had people write down their takeaways from what they were hearing, and then encourage them to share it with one another, like somebody in their family or just in small groups, just with people around them. And that was how it started. And now, again, it's still our sending church, our sending fellowship. And when we go back, it's really fun. They're doing this on Sunday mornings now. They've incorporated it into their service time, where they will spend a few minutes just in corporate gathering, just listening for a minute.
So practically, you're saying it's providing that space. It's providing that space to listen and reflect, and not just, like you said, throw up prayers and or listen. It's actually like listen to the word. It's actually trying to listen to, in a quiet space, listen for the Lord.
Who oddly enough, or maybe not oddly enough, is called the Word, isn't he? The Logos. So we're listening.
That is interesting. Yeah. Fascinating.
Chris, this has been a awesome discussion with you. I think there's a lot of connection points that you've made to our narrative arc here, from the brain science stuff to how the value of relationship, to how we should pray with one another, and space and listening. So Chris, I just thank you for your time and joining us for this discussion. And thank you, listener, for joining us for another episode of A World in Tension.